DW Africa Link.
When I heard the report, I felt shocked because it doesn't match what many of us saw and heard that day. It matters to us because if the truth is not full told, then it means our lives and experiences are not being taken seriously.
To be fair, the people of Tanzania never expected that anything good will come from this report.
More than 500 people dead after an election, and still no one held responsible. Tanzania's Commission of Inquiry confirms the scale of the 2025 election violence, but stops short of naming those behind it. In comments at the ceremony, Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan said the report was, quote, the property of the president. So is this a step toward justice or a sign of impunity? Will there ever be accountability? That's what's coming up. I am Eddie Micah Jr., and you are welcome to Africa Link, the podcast connecting you to the stories that matter.
Africa Link, every weekday here on DW.
Nataka nikiri kwamba mimi binafsi sikutarajia kadhia hii.
I want to personally admit that I did not expect something of this magnitude would happen in this country under my watch. This has placed a heavy burden on my shoulders, but I would like to assure you all that under God's will and guidance, I shall carry this burden bravely with a lot of self-belief and great caution.
That was Tanzania's President Samia Suluhu Hassan, the winner of the 2025 elections that led to violence and the killing of hundreds of people. Here's how we got here. On October 29, 2025, Tanzania held elections that were followed by allegations of irregularities and a crackdown on opposition voices, tensions that escalated into widespread violence. The government then set up a commission of inquiry, and after more than 5 months, it has released its report. It confirms that at least 518 people died from what it calls unnatural causes during the election period, but it does not say who was responsible. Instead, it recommends further investigations, and President Suluhu Hassan is prepared to adhere to it.
In the implementation of the recommendations of the committee, the government will take swift steps as follows. First, a reconciliation committee shall be formed very soon. Then, after the reconciliation committee tables their findings and recommendations, which will be used to guide the constitutional reform process of our country, we shall form a special investigative unit, also known as criminal investigation, which will look into and get verified information implicating those who were involved in the planning, mobilizing, and funding acts of violence. Also, the unit will look into deaths of the youth and issues around bodies that are missing.
Rights groups say that the report falls far short of justice. For more on this, let's bring in Orien Nyeko, senior researcher in the Africa division at Human Rights Watch. Hello, Orien. Welcome to Africa Link. Let me first get your reaction to the Commission's finding.
Well, obviously, this is something that we'd been waiting for quite some time. The president had announced that this commission would be formed late last year, which is obviously a very important step. So there was a lot of anticipation that this could be a really important opportunity to really elaborate on what took place during the elections, and especially around the issue of accountability and responsibility for those abuses. So listening in to the speech by the chairperson when he was delivering the report, that's what I anticipated we would hear, and there was very little around the accountability question. So that was a disappointment. But I think it's also kind of an opportunity for many people to continue to press the government to do the right thing, even if this report hasn't really tackle the issues that I think most people were expecting it to tackle. I think it's a chance to draw attention to what organizations like ours found around the election violence.
So then let me ask you, if a commission of inquiry releases such results without any iota of accountability, what kind of result is this really?
The purpose of this commission, you look at about how it came about, was a response to international pressure. A lot of people were asking, what happened? Who was responsible? And I think the government of Tanzania, the president, was very strategic in establishing this as a way to buy time to sort of get their blocks in order, so to speak. I think it's another way of pushing the people who are asking for accountability, making them basically wait a bit longer. It doesn't tackle the critical issue that people were anticipating that it would deal with. It doesn't answer the question that people were asking, who was responsible. It tackles, I think, other issues. It goes a lot into depth about how the protests came about. And I think that was a very intentional and strategic approach from the Tanzanian government to buy time, essentially. And so at this point, I think we as the activists community, people with an interest in what's going on in Tanzania, need to use this as an opportunity. I'm looking at it from a sort of glass half full kind of point of view to continue to press the Tanzanian authorities to center the accountability question. Who was responsible for those acts? Who ordered the security forces to respond in a way that was entirely inappropriate to the protests? And ensure that criminal accountability and people are victims have received justice.
That is obviously the elephant in the room when you talk about the report, right? What was hugely missing was the accountability part. Who carried out these attacks? Or who carried out the violence? Who gave that order? So that's really spot on with how you've explained it. Were you surprised with the number of people that died from what it's being described as unnatural causes in the election violence? Because you hear from the opposition, they talk about thousands of people. You hear from some different groups say that the number has been watered down. Still, we're talking about 518 people. That is the number that came out of this report. What do you make of that?
Well, it's difficult to say. We've been looking into these cases for several months, the violence, and we haven't been able to settle down on a specific number. We're pretty confident that hundreds of people were killed during this period. 518 seems relatively low, but it's difficult to say. I want to flag, though, something that's, I think, people may not be necessarily aware of, that the quote-unquote report, what the chairperson of the commission presented last week, wasn't the actual report. The report that was submitted to the president is not in the public domain. We have his speech, which summarizes what the commission found. And I think, as we were listening to him speak and hearing some of the things that the reporting on his speech, there are questions about how they came to that number, the 518, that need to be asked and then need to respond to in order for us to really be able to say whether this is a true representation of what was found. So, for example, in what he said, they didn't actually talk about how some of the video footage that was circulating during that time, and which we know, at least based on our own research, was legitimate, showing some of those incidents. Did they take that into account in the numbers? Was it only the accounts of people who spoke to them? So many questions that would help us really be able to tackle whether that number is a true reflection of what happened. But again, the report is not in the public domain, which I think is also a problem because the public ought to have that information to be able to really determine whether what they're saying is true.
That's another interesting point you just made. Normally, how is it supposed to work when a report like this is released? It's supposed to be out there for people to access, right? So what do you read into that? The fact that it's not out yet. I mean, we do not know if it's going to be released. The hope is that it should be, but it's not so far. What do you make of that?
I mean, I think ideally the public should have access to this information. This commission was established to, and in theory was established to ensure a start of some sort of justice process for the people of Tanzania who are all impacted by it. So the ownership of the report should be for the public. And I think even if initially it isn't publicly accessible, there should be information about when it is going to be, so that people can ask those kinds of questions and can, I think I think at least from the government's perspective, that's one way of ensuring buy-in from the public. Otherwise, there's just going to be a sense of dissatisfaction. So I think it ought to be a public document. So something I think we'd really urge the Tanzanian authorities to do to make it publicly accessible.
Right. Let's touch on something that is being reported widely. It is being reported that President Samia Suluhu Hassan said the report was, quote, the property of the president. What does that even mean, really?
Well, I assume she's referring to the sort of legal definition that it's a commission that's a judicial commission that's established by the president. And so she sort of established it that's her mandate, that's her prerogative, et cetera, et cetera. Technically, legally, that possibly might be true, but the kind of message that it sends at such a critical and sensitive moment, I think for Tanzanians is not a positive one. As I said earlier, this whole commission and the response to the violence last year really should center the Tanzanian people. And even things like the mandate of the commission really should center how this is something that is going to address the many victims across the country. It's not about how, for example, government property was destroyed or how the opposition or social media activists rallied to disrupt the elections, which I want to point out is something that the chairperson talked about extensively, how that was the cause of the election violence. So I think the language around this report and this commission, it centers the government, it centers the president, which is something I don't think it's very helpful in achieving this notion of unifying the country after such a devastating time during the elections last year.
Because if you say that's the property of the president, I mean, if something is my property, then I can decide to release it. I can decide to do whatever I want with it. So I definitely hear your point on the kind of language being used, especially in this case, when you say the property of the president. Then what does it mean for those that are actually seeking the accountability and the answers and all the information that they need to somehow have the closure? So that's basically your point, right? That this is just not going to help the situation, is it?
Exactly. Yeah, I think it sends the wrong message. And ironically, that is the reason why people went out on the streets in the first place in October, is because they felt that their voices weren't being heard. That was a big chunk of why the opposition was calling for constitutional reform and that whole campaign of no reforms, no elections, because the constitution currently gives a huge amount of power to the president. And so they'd been calling for amendments for many, many years and felt that they weren't being heard. So I think in some ways, this commission and the language around it is reinforcing some of the grievances that Tanzanians had in the first place. And I think if you're trying to address those broader issues, then you have to really rethink how you talk about the response to them. And I think, so it's kind of like a cycle that's being repeated.
Right. So look, at the end of the day, the Commission of Inquiry recommended further investigations, right, as you've also touched on. Is that a meaningful advancement of justice, or is it a delay of justice, you think?
Well, this is something that we've been calling for. And when I say we, I mean the activist community and everybody who has a vested interest in the issue around justice for the election violence, that criminal accountability needs to take place. And I think it is correct for the commission to call for that. I think the issue in this particular point is the lack of specificity about what that would look like and to whom that accountability would be designed to address. I mean, if we are being, I think our research, for example, it's very clear that, for example, that police officers were the ones who went out and shot protesters, people who were not protesting. And so when you say, oh, there needs to be a investigative commission, for example, I think the specificity around what it is addressing would be very helpful. But the problem, as I mentioned, is we're not getting the full report. We're getting a summary, and we're not being provided with the opportunity to interrogate what that really means. So I think the lack of detail around that really kind of did a disservice to people who I think really would want to ask those questions. And I think the commission has sort of more work to do in explaining and elaborating on what accountability would look like.
Right. And when we talk about further investigations, I mean, do we know if it's already started, how long that could take? What can we expect from the next release, and when could that be?
So the commission, they recommended the establishment of an investigative commission, and then the president herself said she's going to do that. They're going to establish it. When that is going to happen, we don't know yet. I think it's something to continuously ask. As I said, this is a chance to really continue to put pressure on the Tanzanians to not say that, oh, this is just the end. This is not the solution people were asking for. That's, you've released this report, everything is fine. So yeah, I think that's essentially the question that needs to be asked. I'm repeating what you've just said, but that's how I feel about it, and I think many other people feel as well.
That's fair. Thanks for highlighting that, because as you basically say, there's still a lot of questions left unanswered, and you say this is the chance to just keep probing, which it seems a bit kind of a handicapped situation. All you can do is seek answers and wait if you get it or not. Right. And I mean, this is one of the things that a lot of people talk about regional bodies, right? Start from the motherboard, the African Union, and then you come to the regional bodies. Should they be doing more to put pressure on Tanzania to really deal with this issue?
Oh, absolutely. I think the regional voices are the most critical. I think that they, as I said, they have a vested interest. If Tanzania is not peaceful, if people are dissatisfied with what is going on in the country, and I mean the people of Tanzania, and conflict is latent, things are not addressed, that's going to bleed into the rest of the region, into the neighboring countries. And it also, I think, sends a message. If the authorities are held to account, I mean, police officers and security forces are held to account for violence, that's something that cannot happen in other neighboring countries. You have election periods that are coming up in Kenya, for example, and there's always the fear that the kind of violence that happened in Tanzania could be replicated. So I think that the regional bodies really, they obviously play a role. They have a huge amount of influence, and they should be speaking up more than they have in the past, because it's vitally important that they do.
We seem to be at a point where people can only put pressure on the government to give information, right? So based on where we are at now, what can we expect moving forward in terms of credible accountability. One, what would that look like? And what can we expect moving forward?
So Tanzania is a very complex country, and I think people oftentimes don't necessarily realize that what happened during the elections is a part of a bigger problem. The human rights situation has been, getting worse and worse over the last 10 years, actually. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's the lack of reform, the constitutional reform that I mentioned. There's the attacks on political opposition and on media and activists. There's this laws that have been passed which have made it extremely restrictive for civil society, media, opposition to operate. And I think that in addition to, calling for this accountability for the election violence call that people need to continuously make, we also need to call for the kind of reform around the human rights situation broadly in Tanzania, because if that's not addressed, this again is going to be a continuous cycle where people who are critical of the government are just going to. What happened during the elections is part of a broader problem, and if the Tanzanian authorities don't address this wider repressive context, repression against opposition, critics, media, etc., there's just going to be a cycle of conflict and violence that keeps happening in Tanzania. And I think that people who are interested in what's going on, including Tanzanians themselves, need to continuously put pressure on the Tanzanian authorities to deal with the broader situation. And my last point was that I think that if we continuously talk about these things, that the Tanzanians will heed this call. The situation in Tanzania, what happened during the elections is part of a broader repressive environment that has gotten worse over the last 10 years. And I think people need to continuously draw attention to that the election violence didn't just happen in isolation.
Right. Thank you very much, Ori, for that. And, well, we here at DW, we've been keeping tabs on the situation in Tanzania. We were on the ground all over covering the elections, and we'll be continuing to do that and see what eventually comes out of the further investigation that has been called. So many thanks for sharing your insights with us, Ori Nyako, Senior Researcher in the Africa Division at Human Rights Watch. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Africa is changing. Don't get left behind. Tune in to Africa Link.
People are seeking accountability of whoever was involved in the killings and want justice to be served.
When I heard the report, I felt shocked because it doesn't match what many of us saw and heard that day. It matters to us because if the truth is not full told, then it means our lives and experiences are not being taken seriously. Honestly, I don't think those responsible will be held accountable because we rarely see real action after such reports. What worries me most is that if nothing changes, the same kind of situation and violence could happen again, and people will continue to live in fear without justice and accountability in our country.
If post-election violence can result in hundreds of deaths and still produce no clear attribution of blame, that weakens trust in state institutions, doesn't it? Especially the police, the judiciary, and the electoral system. For victims' families, the absence of names and consequences can even feel like a second injustice. What do you think? Share your thoughts with us on Facebook at DW Africa. Listen on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to our DW Africa YouTube channel so you never miss an episode. This show was co-produced and edited by Isaac Mugabe, And I am Eddie Micah Jr. Thanks for listening.
DW, made for minds.